Sorry, I can't read Spanish. Okay, so all right, so this is a study on the Columbia Basin hatchery programs and funding of a Mitchell Act congressional funding for these hatchery programs. So the work is funded and conducted by the National Marine Fisheries Service, and that's a federal agency in the United States of America. And they conducted the study, and they provided financial support for consultants that they hired to help them on specific technical expertise. And we helped them in fisheries, socioeconomics, environmental justice, wildlife, water quality, and human health. I supported the National Marine Fisheries Service regarding compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act and providing technical review for the various disciplines. The study has been ongoing since 2004, so it's over a 10-year study, and it's due to substantial modeling and the quantitative effort that was done. The proposed action for this is an environmental impact statement, is to guide the NIMS's distribution of these Mitchell Act funds that come every year. So they give the funding to the NIMS, and then they give it to different hatchery programs. But NIMS wants to conduct this modeling effort to inform themselves of the individual Columbia Basin hatchery programs under the Endangered Species Act. So there are 178 salmon and steelhead hatchery programs at 80 hatchery facilities. So some facilities have more than one species, and each species represents a hatchery program. And so they produce 143 million salmon and steelhead. And these salmon and steelhead are for recreational fishing and Native American subsistence fishing. The Mitchell Act provides the annual funding for the hatchery operations in the Columbia Basin. It is not 100%. They only provide some of the funding. And it was passed to protect fishery resources from development in general, including water diversions. NIMS distributes the Mitchell Act funds to operate 62 programs that produce 71 million fish. So you can see all their funding doesn't produce all the fish. Generally, most hatcheries on the Columbia and the Snake Rivers were built to mitigate for lost fish due to the presence of dams. The dams flooded historical spawning habitat and increased mortality. As the fish pass through each of the 29 dams, they get injured as they move up, and eventually very few of them get past all 29 dams. Mitigation is especially important to the tribes who lost their historical fishing opportunities following the dam construction. So the risks that the hatchery fish produce is that they are less fish fit than natural origin fish. Some hatchery origin adults may naturally spawn and affect the future fitness of natural origin fish. So what happens is the hatcheries produce these fish and then they release them in the rivers. And these hatchery fish actually go out to sea and come back. And when they return, they have their adipose fin clipped. So when recreational fishers come in, they only take those with the adipose fin clipped. But still, some hatchery fish, they will home back to that hatchery that they occurred at. And as they move up to the hatchery, they've got these weirs that would prevent the fish from moving beyond the hatchery and naturally spawning. However, hatchery fish are unpredictable, and sometimes they'll go up to another tributary and spawn, so they can escape. And that's when the less fit occurs. In addition, these hatcheries also, and there are some areas where the natural origin fish are basically endangered. There's very few left. And so we do use hatcheries, what they call conservation hatcheries, and we actually try to improve some fish populations, and we actually encourage those fish in those hatcheries, and then we try to make sure that they're the correct, the correct genetics that would naturally spawn. But if the hatchery facility has problems with it, we end up, losing mortality with some of the listed fish, the conservation hatcheries. We also have the potential for stream dewatering. Hatchery needs a lot of water. So they pull that water out of the stream, and then you end up, affecting the natural origin fish that occur in that stream. In addition, there's fish entrainment. Some of those weirs for the natural origin fish, they get caught in the weirs and they are damaged. So then they have a harder time once they get, actually get hand pulled and then released above the weirs. And then there's deterioration of downstream water quality because the hatcheries have to put in chemicals to prevent the disease from occurring. And then there's competition. When you release a hatchery origin fish, they're going to compete with natural origin fish, as the natural origin fish are also coming through. There's also the larger hatchery fish. So let's say hatchery Chinook could prey on the smaller coho or the smaller pink. Or they could actually prey, if you release a yearling Chinook, it could prey on sub-yearling natural origin Chinook. And then there's masking, and masking occurs when these hatchery origin fish come in, and then they're occurring in all these spawning grounds. When you're trying to keep counts, you lose count as to which is natural origin, which is hatchery origin. And then harvest. Sometimes you can accidentally harvest the hatchery origin fish. And lastly, the hatchery origin fish could transmit disease. So the benefits of these hatchery programs, there's always pluses and minuses. So the benefits is that now we provided harvest opportunity for recreational fishing and for tribal harvest. There's viability for these conservation programs where you can bring in some more fish to an area that's totally deplete and with fish. And then there's marine-derived nutrients. So as those hatchery fish come back, we harvest as much as we can, but some will still get all the way back to the hatchery. And as they get them at those weirs, they will take them and they'll deposit them at the top of the tributaries, so then there's marine-derived nutrients. So that's an advantage. And then other fish and wildlife are now become dependent on the hatchery origin fish. So the Endangered Species Act that we have in the United States protects species that are listed as endangered or threatened. And it's administered by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, primarily. But for the National Marine Fisheries Service, any fish that's anadromous, which means it occurs in saltwater, oceans, while it's living, and then it spawns in freshwater. And then so endangered species is any species in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range, whereas a threatened species is one that is likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. So here's the issue. Now that we have all these hatcheries, we now have many endangered and threatened species in the Columbia River. And so there's 5 species, but there's 10 what they call evolutionary significant units. In other words, these fish come back to certain watersheds, and if they're totally independent and they don't ever breed with any other, or not breed, but I'm sorry, I'm a wildlife biologist. Sometimes I mix up the words. But anyway, if they don't spawn or co-occur with any others, they're totally separate. It's called evolutionary significant unit for salmon, and for steelhead, it's called distinct population segment. So so now you can see how these dams have impacted salmon and steelhead in the Columbia River. So here's where it's in the United States, and it shows Washington, but the Columbia River is in the very, very southern edge of Washington. And here's a better picture where you can see in blue. It comes from here and it goes all the way up to Canada, and then Montana also has tributaries to the Columbia River, and you can see the Snake River all the way down to Wyoming. This is a huge, huge river system. So the issues are, when they allocated the Mitchell Act funds, they did not account for how hatchery of production might be affecting risks that occur to natural origin salmon and steelhead. And the NIMS, they have this dual role. Number one, they have to give money out for the Mitchell Act funding, but number two, they have to protect threatened and endangered fish. And the hatcheries and those fish are posing risks. So they have this dilemma, okay, what do we do now? So they decide to do what you'd call an SEA, Strategic Environmental Assessment. And in the United States, it's called Programmatic Environmental Assessment. And here, it's just referred to as an EIS. So the purpose of NAED was to develop a policy direction that will guide NMSA's decisions as to how to distribute Mitchell funds. So they don't distribute funds to the wrong hatchery program. And then to use the data collected from these EIS studies to help inform NIMS in their Endangered Species Act review of hatchery programs. So they can go to each hatchery program and say, now that we've got this data that your program is impacting these fish, we might close down your program, or we may drop down the number of fish that you can produce. So their objectives were to review each hatchery program and determine through modeling and analysis how the programs are currently affecting salmon and steelhead. Understand the cumulative effects of operating Mitchell Act-funded hatchery programs when considering other actions that are ongoing at the same time, which is additional hatchery production outside Mitchell Act funds, habitat restoration, development, and climate change. And identify and evaluate alternative ways of funding and operating hatcheries in the Columbia River Basin. Now this is a very complex major EIS, so I'm just going to hit the highlights of